society in those days. It underwent a big change in the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War was a watershed moment for Israeli society. The Yom Kippur War was definitely not that. It had partial impact, influence, and anything that it did socially was that it perhaps rushed through various processes that were generated and created during the Six-Day War. That sounds somewhat in opposition to intuition. I'm not talking about Eretz Yisrael Shlema or messianic movements and the settlement movements. After all, that because of the gap between these two wars, so many social things took place. Because of the gap created, I think that after the Six-Day War, the political rift was deepened between the left wing and the right wing. And before the Six-Day War, it was irrelevant. And only was it only the Six-Day War that created this political sort of rift into something significant and meaningful, because the whole idea of this greater Israel was no longer something delusional, but the new reality of our state. That's what happened after the Yom Kippur War. The public was no longer captive in the ideology of the Labour Party, which was the controlling elite, but rather suddenly heard other voices. So don't forget that in March 71, the demonstrations that really shook everyone of the Black Panthers, that was an upheaval, and they were horrific from the point of view of the institutional then, and everyone wanted to oppress them and suppress them. So in other words, what the war did is it continued or reinforced processes that had existed beforehand. And I'll aggravate this somewhat and accentuate it. I would say that the 1971 political upheaval would have happened even without the Yom Kippur War, because of these processes that had been ignited beforehand and taken place because of the Six-Day War. Now, let's take something else. Let's take the trauma that everyone talks about, the trauma of the Yom Kippur War. Was that something new, trauma? What, in the War of Independence, there wasn't a population trauma, that they didn't undergo a trauma? In the Six-Day War, a month before the Six-Day War, wasn't there a sense of trauma? In other words, a basic lack of self-security is part of being a Jew in the state of Israel. That's part of our Israeliness. That's a lack of self-security. And at the same time, simultaneously, you also feel a kind of mixture between confidence and lack of confidence, security and lack of self-security. You're worried if it was the terror incidents and all sorts of things that were happening. In other words, all these take place. Now let us go back for a moment to the higher echelons, the elite, the political elite. By the way, and it wasn't just a political elite, there was an elite in all the domains, and that was of the veterans, of the secular Ashkenazis from the Labour Party, who started after the Six-Day War in showing signs of exhaustion, of corrosion, and losing its authority, because suddenly on the right-winger side there is a feeling that there could be things that could create a buy-in. Was it Gachal or what? No, because of this idea of the Greater Israel, and it hadn't been relevant before the Six-Day War. So now one can say, sort of in an opposite way, the whole idea of the partition of Israel became much harder after you're in control of Israel and the Judean Samaria. Suddenly things went topsy-turvy from the power play, the ideological power play. So this kind of weakening of the authority and its clout, the labor force, the labor movement's clout. Don't forget that until 67 there were elections, but you knew that it would always be Mapai who would come up with the upper hand. They could choose who their partners were going to be, but in other words, there was a political system of one party. I doubt whether if in the 50s or 60s it was a real democracy in Israel. It was obvious, it was clear. It wasn't a kind of market of ideas or various games of various players. Not at all. And suddenly in the 70s, it started falling apart, and not in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, but rather in the aftermath of the Six-Day War that brought about many processes, economic changes and other things, not only political ones. And I don't know how many of you knew, it was in the 70s, it was published many years later, that in the 70s, everything that we know about the new historians and these critical social science studies, suddenly people who had been sort of really believed in ideological ideas and entrenched in them, like the Black Panthers and others, but even the National Zionists came up with ideas of neo-Zionism and all sorts of various runs of life. And I do not actually connect this and affiliate it actually to the Yom Kippur War, because I believe that it was the Six-Day War that brought about this turnaround. I mean, you spoke about the Wadi Salib in 59 and other protests, but you said that you were someone who'd studied abroad and you specialized in your field exactly when there were winds of change in America, in France, in England. Was it a kind of flowing and a trickling in of those winds of change in the various countries around the world that permeated Israel as well? Yes, there was an influence from abroad as well. And I studied abroad, and I was also impacted and influenced by the equal rights movement in the States and the feminist movement in the States. And I came with these ideas, and I was in that movement in the 50s in Israel with very vehement critical sort of criticism of social issues and in all the sort of fields in Israel. I'll give you an example. In the first Land Day, Yom HaAdamah, in 1976. Why was it? Because what happened is suddenly the Arab citizens, after the Six-Day War, they found themselves in a new situation of Islamization and Palestinization of their identity. And in 76, you could only see it, but you can't say it was only because of that. They were very influenced by it, not only because of their territories, but their greater influence was in fact because of their Israelization protests, because they suddenly saw that there were protest movements all around them, surrounding them. Suddenly it was a different, the Prime Minister suddenly was taken, was exchanged for the Minister of Defense and all sorts of things. And there were elections and there were things going on. And you can see that in the various slums in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and those various kind of neighborhoods and other movements like the Black Panthers and others. And they were definitely influenced by the Jews no less than they were influenced by their Palestinian brethren. because in the 70s it was a period of great change in Israeli society, in the economic sphere, in the intellectual and spiritual and sort of spheres as well. And the Yom Kippur War was just like a catalyst, really, that empowered these various processes that were ignited by the Six-Day War.